Chapter 7, The Aftermath of While the World Watched by Carolyn Maul McKinstry. As a little girl, I remember hearing stories about my grandmother, Mama Leslie, sitting at the front window of her home holding a loaded Smith & Wesson. My preacher grandfather traveled a lot in those days. Mama Leslie had 5 little girls to protect, one of them, my mother. During long dark nights, alone with her daughters, she watched at the window, her gun loaded and aimed, until her husband came home. Perhaps she too sang, "All along this Christian journey, I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me." Mama Leslie told her 5 daughters never to open the door to a stranger, especially a white man. She cautioned them about her dealings with white people because she had seen firsthand some of the things white men had done to Clanton's black folk. One day her daughter, Dorothy, about 7 years old at the time, went to answer a knock on their front door. She looked out the door's small window, and without opening the door, she ran back to Mama Leslie. "Mama," she cried, "there's some white man at the door." Mama Leslie walked to the door and looked out the window. Then she quickly opened the door and invited the man inside. "Dorothy," she said, and then laughed, "that's your Uncle Johnny. He's Daddy's brother." Dorothy had never met Uncle Johnny before that day. His straight black hair and white skin scared her. In later years, when Mama Leslie told me this story, I wondered, if he was an uncle, why did Johnny have white skin? Eventually, I discovered that my maternal grandfather had a white daddy. After my friends' deaths, I better understood why Mama Leslie had guarded her young brood so carefully. I didn't feel safe anymore. Violence, bombs, and death permeated our lives in those civil rights days in Birmingham. I have never needed it, but I still have Mama Leslie's old Smith & Wesson. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing opened wide the eyes of the United States to racial injustice. Governor Wallace's hard face and tightly knit brows, plastered on the front of Time magazine some 12 years later, covered the nation's coffee tables and city nightstands or newsstands. When I saw the photograph, I wondered, is this the state of things to come? I remember thinking that Governor Wallace would always...
Ms. Barrett, please report to the front office. Ms. Barrett, please report to the front office.
I remember thinking that Governor Wallace would always be a permanent fixture, holding black people back, a roadblock to the progress my people yearned to achieve. Wallace controlled where Alabama's black people lived, where their children went to school, what public facilities they could and could not visit, and where or if they could receive hospital and medical care. Just how much influence will this man have on our black population? I wondered. The segregation here wasn't merely established by cultural habits or choices. It was dictated by Alabama's laws about interaction between whites and blacks. To disregard these laws often meant severe punishment. Since no whites in Alabama, or the rest of the South for that matter, spoke out about the injustices done to black Americans, I assumed that Wallace represented the thoughts and opinions of all white people. Earlier, I might have thought he reflected just white men, because from what I saw, the South's white women didn't appear as violent or as vocal as the men. White women didn't wear Klan robes or aggressively protest against integration like their husbands, fathers, and brothers and sons did. Some white women even seemed compassionate and caring toward little black girls and their families. But in 1957, at age 9, I was stunned to see on television and in the newspapers the hate-filled faces of Arkansas's white women, mostly mothers, angrily protesting the Little Rock Nine. They were adamant that these black students could be banned from the all-white Little Rock Central High School. By the time I was a teenager, I felt I had no reason to trust a white person. I thought they were all like Governor Wallace. After the church bombing, sickened by the tragedy that had sent shockwaves across the world, President John F. Kennedy sent 500 armed soldiers to stabilize the city of Birmingham and calm the racial chaos. An article written exclusively for the Saturday Evening Post after the bombing captured the president's reaction this way. President Kennedy, echoing the national temper, said he felt a deep sense of outrage and grief. The president also flooded our neighborhood with FBI agents from Washington. They visited black homes throughout Birmingham. They interviewed all the members who had attended church on that tragic Sunday morning, and they wrote down what each person said. When 2 white FBI men came to my house, my mother and father sat close to me on the sofa. I answered the questions as best I could. The men asked if I had seen anything suspicious or anything unusual at the church that morning before the bombing. No, I told them. They asked, "Can you tell us in your own words what happened?" I told them everything I remembered. The men seemed disinterested in my answers. Their attitudes were cold and matter of fact. I told them about the phone call I'd received in the office that morning, only seconds before the bomb exploded. 3 minutes, the man had said to me. The investigators failed to write that down. I wish later I'd asked them to read the information they jotted on their pads of paper. They also questioned my 2 brothers about the bombing. I felt a certain sense of hope that day as I spoke with the FBI. These men are going to find the people responsible for killing my friends, I thought. I knew capturing the criminals wouldn't bring back my friends, but it certainly would get the murderers off of our streets. When these killers are caught and locked up, I reasoned, I won't have to worry about them planning another bomb in my church. They can't bomb the church, and they can't kill me if they're in prison. I felt like an adult when I spoke with the FBI, but I wasn't. I was still a kid, and I was still afraid of dying. The FBI promised the American people they would find the killers. They would conduct the biggest manhunt since the Dillinger case, they said. But time passed and no one in our community had heard a word about the case. Whenever we called and asked about the progress being made to catch the bombers, we received the same answer: the FBI is working on the case. 2 men, Robert Chambliss and Charles Cage, had been arrested earlier and charged with illegal possession of dynamite. They were fined a mere $100 each and sentenced to 180 days in jail. The irony was that everyone, including the FBI, who knew who the bombers were. When the FBI concluded their interviews, they sent a memorandum to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover stating the results of their investigation. They listed 4 Ku Klux Klansmen as suspects: Robert E. Chambliss, Bobby Frank Cherry, Herman Frank Cash, and Thomas E. Blanton, Jr. Most people in the black community thought Hoover tried to block prosecution of the guilty Klansmen, but according to the FBI reports, his concern was to prevent leaks, not to stifle justice. He couldn't have blocked the prosecution and didn't. He simply didn't think the evidence was there to convict. Sometime in 1968, when I was in college, the FBI officially closed and sealed its investigation, charging no one for the murders. When I learned that the case had been closed and no one had been charged for the deaths of my 4 friends, I immediately thought about their parents. What does it feel like to have a daughter violently killed and then 5 years later to have the tragedy practically swept under the rug as if it never happened? How could the white community ignore the cruel injustices and pain suffered by those families? That year, a reporter with USA Today interviewed me about the experience. I can't describe everything that happened, I told him, but I cannot tell you the FBI caught the guilty men and brought them to justice. I cannot tell you that the officials in Birmingham honored the 4 girls by naming buildings after them. It seems the girls were just forgotten. Maybe nobody thought my friends' lives were worth bringing the murderers to justice. If this tragedy had happened today instead of in 1963, Monday morning would have no doubt been set aside as an official day of mourning in Birmingham. City officials would send out teams of crisis counselors to the Birmingham schools to talk with students and help them cope with their confusion, anger, and grief. Parents would schedule appointments for their children with licensed psychologists and closely monitor them for the days, weeks, and months ahead. But in 1963, in Birmingham's black community, that didn't happen. On Monday morning, September 16th, my brothers and sisters and I woke up, dressed in our rooms as always, and then met together in the kitchen to eat. Daddy made a hearty breakfast like he did every morning. We ate in silence. We left on time for school and work as if nothing had happened the day before. It was as if my four friends were still alive and well and getting ready for school in their own homes. I felt numb. What am I supposed to do now? Do churches get bombed and children get killed and then we all go on living life as usual? Is this just another day in the lives of black people in Birmingham? Days passed, and then weeks, and then we simply walked through our same routines, predictable schedules disturbed only briefly that Sunday morning. No one asked me, Carolyn, are you okay? Carolyn, do you miss your friends? Carolyn, are you afraid? Do you want to talk about what happened at church? Nothing was said. Not at home, not at school. Shortly after the bombing, Reverend C. Herbert Oliver, an African-American pastor in Birmingham, typed out a page-long single-spaced letter to his fellow members of the Inter-Citizens Committee. The day before, he had telegrammed President Kennedy and listed 20 different racially motivated, unpunished actions taken by white men against black people in Birmingham. He included the bombings of black homes and businesses, tear gassings, shootings, physical violence, all committed against black people between the months of March and September 1963. Oliver wrote, "The savage and brutal, murderous and ungodly bombings of 16th Street Baptist Church on Sunday morning, September 14th, has revealed to the whole world the evil of racism. Those few terrifying moments of the blast said that we have been trying to say to the nation for years that there exists in Alabama the most unconscionable disregard for man and God on the part of some." Oliver continued, "If white supremacy consists in the wanton and brutal destruction of worshipers of God in the very house of worship, then I must confess that the church bombers are the most supreme murderers and cowards the world has ever seen. Only the diseased mind can aspire to reach such depths." Then the Reverend Oliver described his eyewitness account of the bombing. "On the morning of the bombing, I stood across the street from the church behind Carbine, bearing policemen and watching as the covered bodies were placed into waiting ambulances. Policemen drove a small crowd off the street. I got on a nearby porch. Women, seeing the covered bodies being brought from the church, cried and screamed without restraint. I could not bring my mind to believe what my eyes saw. It still seems like a tale from some distant land where people know nothing about freedom and democracy." I was unusually quiet at school on Monday morning, September 16th. When I got there, I laid my head down on my desk, numb, confused, mourning my friends. Normally, I loved school and proved an active, talkative student, but empty desks reminded me again that my friends were dead. "What's wrong?" a student in the seat in front of me asked. "I feel bad," I told him. "I don't want to be here." The student turned around and looked me square in the face. "I heard about the bombing yesterday and about the deaths of your friends." I yearned to hear some more words of comfort or consolation from him, from anyone. But that day I received no words of solace, no soothing verbal balm from my schoolmate. He simply said, "Well, frankly, Carolyn, I think you're making more out of this than you should." I walked through that long school day like a zombie.